Oh, geez, that's creepy.
Yeah. All right, and now I'll just hand it over.
Hi, lovely to have you all here. So I'm going to take out my AirPods so I can hear myself a little better. Welcome to the second installment of Manderley Collective's weekly video series. We're trying to kind of put together a thing to kind of alleviate the sense of isolation a lot of us are feeling right now, and in particular, so we can have a kind of creative community in the midst of all of this, and meet and hear some really incredible readers and maybe learn a few things too. So this second installment is called Defying Boundaries. It's a conversation on home and homeland and ancestry and lineage and memory and even deathlessness. And so we're having two really incredible writers who are both genre crossers in their own right. So Waleed Bhatti, who writes normally fiction. He's in the MFA program here at NYU, but also writes poetry. And then Emily Khilfeh, who I first met as a poet, but has also just finished her first novel. So we're going to start with Nancy Huang interviewing Waleed. I'm going to read Waleed's bio, and then we're going to hear some words from him, and then I'm going to hand it over to Nancy. So let me get the bio pulled up 1 second. Waleed is a Pakistani-Canadian writer currently based in Queens, New York. He's an MFA candidate in fiction at New York University. He has received graduate fellowships from NYU and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. He has a ginger cat, quite beautiful, I will add, named Sesame, who he has yet to feature in a story because she's a punk. He writes stories about transcendence, ghost dogs, and anything else that's difficult to publish. Waleed, let's hear it.
Woo. What? So do I read now, or is Nancy gonna ask me anything?
No, you read now, dude. What?
Oh, okay.
You read right now. Bring like.
Okay. So I'm gonna read like an excerpt from a short story that I'm working on right now. So like the beginning, like the first quarter maybe, and then 2 short poems. So I'll start with the story. And like I'm reading it off my computer, so I apologize if I'm accidentally staring at somebody's soul as I look at this. I'm not actually looking at you. All right. So this is called, working title is A Gathering, and I'll start. Okay. Gathering. I knew Sal was dead when he called me and said, "Paradise is dull. How's Mom doing?" "Not good," I said. "How'd it happen?" The line disconnected for a brief moment, static against my eardrums. "Accident," I heard Sal say. I kept quiet. I didn't know how to phrase the only question I wanted to ask without accusing him. "I gotta go." Sal's voice warped higher pitch. "These calls, they're not really easy to make. I mean, yeah, I'm okay though. Tell Mom I'm sorry." I said nothing. When I was young and had nothing else to do, I practiced being as quiet as possible, slow the breathing, move each limb as if it's slicing through loud butter. Don't even look around quickly. The liquid around your eyeballs is a tsunami. Silence is wire thin, the most artificial of things. But Sal knew me. He knew I was still there. "Riz, make sure you call me again," I said, and removed the headphones from my ears, ending the call. On the popcorn ceiling above my bed, I tried to shape the jagged peaks and concave craters into an image, a whirlpool of cottage cheese. With the bright Toronto darkness filtering through my window as my default palette, I could only paint certain shapes, blocky details and outlines were the basis of this art. As my eyes moved around looking for matching points, something that the lack of light mixed with orange street light ambiance made a woozy process, I managed to get a shape started. I thought of crafting Sal. As I started in on his features, the slightly too far apart eyes and the hook nose and the narrow nostrils, orifices were always easy because I could leave them as dark patches in the ceiling. My concentration broke. Motorcycle. It sounded like a motorcycle, whipped past my building and stopped with a metallic screech at the intersection 6 stories right below my bedroom. Traffic in this part of the city wasn't consistent enough to become background noise. Freelancing was hard enough without the roar of engines cleaving through the neighborhood at 3 in the morning. I could hear the bikes stalling. Must have been a red light. I wanted to go out on my balcony and scream. What would I say? I couldn't yell, otherwise I'd look like the crazy one. Maybe I'd amplify my voice and let it travel down so it sounded professional, cold, and menacing. I thought I was tempted to get out of bed and do this. I thought I almost did. Instead, I lay back flat against my bed and stared at my ceiling but saw nothing, and with a blank acceptance, realized I couldn't recall the details of my brother's face. The funeral was small, mostly family, some friends. My father held my mother as one group, then another came to them, crying, offering words of advice, praying. Sal's manager from 2 jobs ago, the organic coffee shop, came and gave our parents a basket arrangement of white lilies, orchids, alstroemeria, and carnations with a little silver cross in it. I heard his wife yelling at him quietly at the tea table, telling him to look around. Did he think we were surrounded by Christians? My Italian aunt, the often pale woman who'd married my mother's youngest brother 7 years ago and treated me and Sal like the son she couldn't have, now wore a black shawl over a black dress and with black stockings and black heels and had black mascara running down her cheeks. This was her first Muslim funeral, and no one had told her black wasn't a requirement. She moved like a wraith among the others, who dressed in colors commonly worn to dinner parties, a gathering of people. Birth or death was all this was. My father's sister and her family stood dry-eyed. They'd flown in from Paris for the funeral and burial. No English, and their Urdu barely passable. They spoke little and to no one besides my father and themselves. They wanted to know about the overdose, the pain meds. Had it really been an accident? Sal's friends huddled together by the corner opposite the casket and only spoke to the other guests if they were approached first. I'd never really gotten to know them, could barely remember their names. I could barely remember their names. Brian, Rin, Claire, Adil. Since his first year of undergrad, Sal had spent far more time with them than he had at home. What was it like to lose such a close friend? Did they feel like they weren't really living this moment? Rin caught me staring at them. She was the one I'd spoken to a few times, polite exchanges, nothing more. But in this moment, must have felt to her a bond second only to that with Sal. I knew her smile was a request for me to join them, pleading, share your grief with us. I turned around and with an exaggerated wave, pretended to notice a relative I hadn't spoken to yet. Evening fell. The guests left the funeral home slowly and then all at once. I drove my parents home and stayed with them. It was only on my old bed under the fluorescent lights of the 401 seeping through my window that I let myself think about Sal for a moment. I hadn't looked at his face during the viewing and I never would again. I ground my teeth and when I woke, my entire jaw felt like it'd been pounded into cement. We buried him the next morning. The November chill worked its way gently into our bodies and before long, had sunk into my bones. There was a large pile of dirt by the grave next to the excavator. The imam arrived at 10 a.m. My father stood beside me as a group of us lowered the oakwood casket into the freshly carved out hole. It smelled rich, soil and earthworms swarming with life. A shovel stood at each side of the grave, planted headfirst into the dirt. Pulled one out and was surprised at the weight, heavier than I thought. My mother was crying, not the loud gasping sounds of my aunt, but the silent flow of tears that would, someday 30 years from now, still catch her unaware. A merciless reminder of what she'd lost. My father's hands trembled, and I hated it. I positioned myself and using the shovel, threw some dirt down into Sal's casket. I did this 2 more times before my father reached for the shovel. After he and my mother threw in their share, the rest of the family grabbed the other shovels and began the same. After everyone had done this once or twice, we made way for the excavator, which gathered the remaining dirt back into its original place. We then patted the earth down to a rounder, more pleasing shape. The imam said something about God's mercy, giving the grieving family the strength to pull through, protecting ourselves from those who spread needless gossip, to appreciate every second we were allowed to live. Eventually, we all made our way back to the Creator. He then led a silent prayer. I stood still, hands palmed in front of me. No prayers came to mind. Sal had called me once. Maybe he'd call again. Better than a prayer with no answer. The silence of the cemetery made me uneasy. The only noise my aunt's weeping and the whispering chatter of 2 younger cousins behind me. Saleh Bhai's going to hell. Don't say that. It's true. He killed himself, didn't he? They said it was an accident. The tips of my fingers felt frostbitten, reverberations of dread pounding my skull. And there's a pause. I'm not sure why, Sal said, but I'm kind of sad I missed out on the funeral. Aunt Sylvia cried like a horse, I said. Your whole crew showed up. I wonder what that's like, Sal said, crying like a horse. I shrugged. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling. It was 4 a.m., 1 week after the funeral. The orange streetlight ambiance still seeping through my window. Less traffic tonight. I held my hands up against the headphones in my ears, keeping them there. I didn't want one to fall out by mistake and end the call. Riz, I stayed silent. You hate me. No, I said, but it was a whisper. It wasn't the worst thing, Sal said to himself. I don't feel much anymore. I'm vapor. I thought about screaming. I wanted him to know that I did feel. I was here and he wasn't. I stayed silent. Aunt Sylvia cried. Sal paused. Funny, I don't really remember who she is. The old quartz clock I'd mounted on the wall right across from my bed ticked. It had been ticking this whole time and I'd never noticed. The sound disturbed me, and when I focused my eyes to check the time, it looked like 3 hands were rotating in opposing directions. Here is, Sal said. What color is your hair again? Black, like our parents and theirs and all generations before us had. From the moment we crawled out of the sea and grew legs and stood upright, we've had black hair, and always will until the last of us are incinerated with the planet. How could he forget? Call me again sometime, I said, and removed my headphones. I began sleeping poorly. I took off-the-counter pills that did nothing. I took prescription pills that made me feel like I was swimming through a wave of black custard that filled my lungs and eyes and ears until I was the wave and could barely breathe till I forced myself to surface. Killed a few hours every day, but it wasn't sleep. I took on multiple projects to keep busy. A billboard ad for a local brewing company, a series of anti-vaping posters for the TDSB, a book cover for a novel about a couple who could only have sex in their sleep. Each one, my clients dropped me after I gave them nothing for weeks. I stopped taking the pills. My grief counselor is fantastic, my mother said to me one afternoon when we were out for lunch. I'm done grieving, I said. I'm good. She cut my face with one hand and I jerked so hard I almost hit her. I looked into her eyes to see if she knew, but I couldn't meet them long enough. I tried to look anywhere but at her. I focused on the tea in front of me. These bags under your eyes, she said, continuing to touch my face. They're darker than your hair. I've been working late, I said. She released me. I refused to lose another son. Her voice cracked. I wanted to scream at her. He left. He threw himself away. He was selfish and weak and left you a broken person with a gaping hole inside that will swallow you no matter how much you try and outrun it. I just need some rest is all, is what I said. A week later, Alina walked into my apartment. I usually left it unlocked in case Sal ever came back. I hated doing it, but I couldn't stop. You weren't at the funeral, I said. I didn't know if you wanted to see me. I don't. She dropped her bags by the door and opened the windows to let the cold winter air wash out the rusted smell enveloping the apartment. The smell of me. When was the last time you cooked, she asked. Last night, I lied. She made us a light dinner with whatever I had at home. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a spicy chicken broth that we poured over plain white rice. I felt both helpless and happy to be taken care of. We spoke a little as we ate. I asked her about her thesis, how was work, was she strapped for cash? I still had some savings. She asked me about my plans to start a design firm. She didn't need money. Did I need any? She was working odd jobs, but her sister helped out when she could. We didn't speak about Sal. We didn't touch. The next day she came again with full grocery bags. I sorted everything into the fridge and made her the decaf she liked that I still had a box of in the cupboard. We said nothing but sat in each other's company. This became a daily routine. Sometimes we cooked together. Other times we spoke about unimportant things. We even played cards or read books in our own corners. Both our parents were unhappy with the arrangement. We weren't officially divorced, I reminded them. Either live together or don't, they said. You can't do both. For us, it had to be this way. Alina never stayed the night. She didn't know I hadn't slept for almost a month. I still didn't sleep, but I felt less washed out after her visits. The one thing I truly couldn't do, and hadn't done since the funeral, was manage the large amounts of relatives who wanted to see me. Alina did more than she should have to fix that. She'd been the one who, when our marriage was still somewhat functional, It always kept up with our relatives, my family and hers. We traded roles regularly. We both turned mourners away from the apartment home for a week or so, preemptive tear stains covering their cheeks, ready to tell us all the good things they'd heard about Sal from a second cousin twice removed. Must be so upsetting, they'd say. It is, she'd say, taking their gifts and closing the door. The visits stopped, and soon my wife was busy again with her thesis, living in the library most nights, too busy to get the divorce papers ready. Another 2 months passed. I wasn't able to sleep anymore. The lights of the city buzzed and irritated my eyes at night. The various stock graphics and fonts I designed last year and sold on my website in batches brought in enough money to buy groceries. My parents had taken on paying my rent until I could get out of my slump. I was certain they were pulling the money from Sal's college savings. I felt like a parasite living off of him. Rage at my parents for forcing that choice on me, to go live with them or have them pay my rent while I couldn't work. He'd only completed the first year. A part of me knew it didn't matter. The money wouldn't do our family any immediate good sitting in a savings account, but I needed to feel something. Time blended into a smooth paste. I knew the dates, the days, the time. Putting them together gave me a stable place in my own world. That stopped meaning much. I was living in a permanent beige. It was on one of these days that, around sundown, I stepped out onto my balcony to feel the snowfall. It was a few degrees below freezing, but little wind, so I could stand without my coat for a few minutes and let February do its work. The fresh snow softened the neighborhood, sharp edges giving way to white mounds that invited you to fall in, promised to pillow your descent. I couldn't stop looking down, and the more I looked, the more it lost shape, until it became nothing but a flurry of white, a white that didn't resemble snow, but simply a lack of color. A pigeon suddenly launched itself past my face. I hadn't even seen it land on my balcony. I realized I was leaning dangerously over the rail and walked back inside, closing the door behind me. It wasn't until I had the heat on that I felt how cold and dry my skin really was. Then my phone rang. I wanted desperately for my brother to ask how I was. It was my mother. She and my father were planning a family dinner next Friday. She was inviting a few of our relatives, all the ones me and Alina had turned away. She was inviting Sal's friends. She wanted me to be there. She wanted me to bring Alina. She wanted to help me feel less alone. I hung up, saying I'd think about it. And for the first time since my brother's death, almost 3 months after he overdosed on his pain medication, I let myself scream. So that's the excerpt from the story that I'm working on. Thank you for listening. Should I just move into the poetry now? Yes. Sorry, I didn't have Zoom on. I couldn't see if people were nodding or not.
Yes. Go ahead and move into the poetry.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll read this poem. This poem is called Jormungandr. And Jormungandr, just for some context, is the big world serpent in Norse mythology that wraps around the earth. And he has his tail in his mouth. And the Norse myth is that the day he lets go of his tail is the day Ragnarok, the end of the world, begins. So this poem is called Jormungandr. I tore shredded skin and licked clean bled wounds in serpent swirls because I fantasized the real was incisor bare. The real was silent and male. 12, playing street games with the guys, cheap wooden sticks, the thin slivers skin wrapped deep in my thumbs the first time I ate myself. I promised me, them, I'd never cry and I'd never be mince soft. I'd be brittle quick. Now the soft stretches of flesh between index and thumb, full and fat with splintered sharps, leave me salt-made. Electric sweat seeping from porous slots on my face, swept up to my shriveled date pit of the real, hiding in the back cupboard like retired fine china, ashamed. Eating myself down to the crunch of bone for 7 years, I swallowed everything true about my until I was only self. from the nasal cartilage tip down to the laser clipped toenails, snaking upward through leaden innards, where I kept locked crooked teeth smiles and a fear of touch, how I scrunched into a ball when soft hands met my soft chest, and how much I didn't want to hate this sweating body in summer. Self-feasting left me with storming, puke-stained resolve to never weep in front of others, say I love you to my mother, or admit to doing both. I still rip, shed scales, lap clean of blood cuts like a sibling dog, and the real now sniffs pure noise. The real is the least close thing to male. I play boy playing man. My fingers scrape the inside of my guts and drag out the all of me I've eaten, so I can be less man, more me, more my, just be. That's that. And then this is the last poem that I'll read. And I think then is the interview. Okay. Thank you guys for bearing with me through this. It was nice. It's been nice. All right, this poem is called Summer 1985. Summer 1985. My mother sets fire to an old rubber tire that sits in the playground behind our building every summer. She used the Bic lighter and extra virgin olive oil the first time the tire wilted. Oil popped but didn't burn completely, so she collected the drippings on her knees in rough sand in glass Tupperware. She uses matchsticks now. She stores the rancid oil in an old cherry jam jar. Summer 1985. 4 men cut off a car on a forest road in Pakistan. In the passenger seat sat my mother, 16. My grandfather, the driver, stepped out, and one of the men wearing a red-stained balaclava shot him in the head for being the wrong kind of Muslim. Summer winds will always smell of soot and burning rubber. My mother is a vanishing woman, a sheet of fire warm to fingers' touch. Come, that's enough for now. Thank you. Thank you. Bow, I bow.
Yeah, so good. Can I take over, y'all? Okay, Rachel, can I have screen control? Like, can I share my screen?
Not as it is, but I can change that for a second. Hold on.
Okay. How are y'all doing? Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Waleed, for reading. It was so wonderful. I'm glad I got to hear it in your voice. It was great. Can we all like take a deep breath real quick? And that was very quick, Emily. Okay, like a little slower than that. In and out. Okay. Thank you so much, Rachel. Okay, so Rachel has given me full control of, I assume, everything. All right, Waleed, are you okay with me having like your poems put on the screen so everyone can read through it? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Let me see if this is gonna work. Yeah, bitch. Okay. That was a great reading. Thank you so much. And I like had time to look over these pieces before, and I would love to start with Summer 1985. I think that this is a great. I don't know. Like I asked you a lot about lineage and stuff, but I think that like that last line, "Come, that's for now," like was so fascinating for me, just because, and I hope everyone can see this too on their screens. But that last line, it was interesting because it made me it turned the poem on its head for me. It made me wonder who you were writing the story to or for. When I think about lineage, that's also what I think about. Just like how do we make sure to not appropriate things? How do we make sure when we're writing about maybe family history or family stories, how do we make sure that like a story, like how do we make sure a story is ours enough to be able to write about it sometimes? That was my question for you though. Like I was wondering if you think it's true that like some things our ancestors did pass down to us and some things we stole. If you want to, like whatever you want to say about that is great with me.
I mean, so full disclosure to other people in like listening, we got these questions ahead of time, and I was thinking about this one today. And I think like for the most part, I've always treated family history and family in general as something that belongs, like I belong to, and it belongs to me by the very nature of it existing as it does, as like you're born in a family and suddenly it's yours and there's ownership involved, and you are theirs. But I think when it comes to writing about it or taking bits and pieces out of like my family history or family experiences and putting them into either stories or poems now, I guess I kind of treat it as like things that have genuinely impacted me, whether or not I was around for them when they happened. You know, like if this story didn't happen, maybe I wouldn't exist, or maybe I wouldn't be in the family that I am. Maybe I wouldn't have ownership of this group, of these ties, or vice versa. So I don't know. I guess I've always had like a very selfish view of family, and that I always treat it as something that is sort of ripe for treatment in fiction and poetry. I don't know. I do think that there are problems with that. I do, because like some of the stuff, like in this poem specifically, a lot of this poem is fiction. But there are certain parts of it that are true, but I've also twisted and changed to suit more the feeling that I'm going for, rather than presenting a true history. And so I don't know if I have the answer to whether or not, whether or not we should be allowed to do that or not, or whether it's good or bad. I do think that there is such a degree of connection that you can't really, I think most of us, when we think about family, we don't really give it more of a second thought. It is ours and we are theirs. And so it's almost like this symbiotic relationship. I think at least that's how I've treated it for a long time. So I don't know if I can answer the question if there are certain things we steal. I would think that there are certain things we steal from our family's history, and we use them for our own, I mean, I don't want to say for our own gain, but for our own understanding or for our own purposes, we'll use something that belonged to, yes, family, but also specific individuals who had their own lives to live and their own experiences that we can't experience, even if they are family. So I would say, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think that is a selfish answer, by the way. You said it was selfish. I don't think it is. I think that's a very confident answer. Thank you. The second question about this poem too was like, I don't know, reading this made me think about ritual and the practice of having a ritual. I'm wondering like what your fire tire ritual is. What do you do that vanishes you? Because at the end, when my mother's a vanishing woman, that kind of, I don't know, that tipped me off into thinking, oh, is this ritual like an act of making yourself disappear, or what is that for you?
I mean, this is probably just really cliche, but I mean, in a way, writing is an act of vanishing. It's both. I guess it's a bit of both. Like it's extremely self-indulgent in a certain way. It's one of the most egotistical things you can do, is to write your thoughts and your feelings as if they deserve space on a page. But it's also a way to kind of disappear into a mode that isn't fully you. And so I guess that would be my vanishing ritual, right? It's like when I can sort of leave myself and invent new realities while writing. That's about as much as I can probably ritualistically disappear over and over again.
Thank you so much. I have everything of yours open on this fucking tab. So my next question, like, is kind of pivoting towards like more of a more into this story. I remember, so you've been binging Tiger King with me and like a few other people in our program, and I remember you saying to us after we'd seen it, and we were talking about it. I remember you saying this because I was sitting in my bathtub and we were talking like over Zoom, just like we're doing now. I remember that you said, I don't think the truth matters unless it's complete. And I remember feeling such a visceral rejection of that in the moment. Like just the split second after you said that, I thought like, no, that, I don't know. I think that it's really fascinating though that you turned around and wrote this story where the narrator is having such like a very, very subjective experience. No one else can talk to Sal except for Riz. And you know, like what does truth mean in that regard? Or maybe people can talk to Sal and we're just not seeing it, which is another way of obscuring the truth or the full, complete, whole truth. Whatever your relationship to truth is, I'm wondering how does it affect perspective and the way you write? And you can talk about this story specifically or like, you know, in general.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way, I think something I really love about fiction and something I really love about literature in general and art in general is that but I guess specifically fiction in this case, is that it exists as a paradox. It exists as this thing that is made up, not true, basically a lie in its most fundamental form. And yet it can provide some of the truest feelings and emotional reactions and even emotional growth that a person might experience might be from reading or hearing a story. And I think the obsession with storytelling that humans have had since we could not even speak from before them, so as soon as we had the ability to communicate in any way, we've been telling stories, whether through drawings or, you know, oral traditions, poetry, epics, the novel now. And so I think that when it comes down to truth, yeah, in a way, I think truth gets chipped away at the less complete it is, but also complete truth is almost, how do you reach that, right? Like, how do you reach something like, even if you know the full story behind something, you know all the details, can that change the way you perceive it? And I guess in my opinion, it doesn't always. I think once we decide on how we feel about something, how our belief about something is, then it doesn't really matter how much truth gets thrown at us. We've decided, and that's that. And so with this story, what I love about doing in my fiction is going through the motions of people having experiences that only they can have. Because I think instead of focusing on this overarching truth or ideas about truth, focusing on individual truths, individual experiences, things that everybody else might disagree with, might deny, and yet this person has been shaped by this experience that is about as true can be for them. And so this story, I guess, kind of coming from that is the idea of dealing with grief and how grief is dealt with. And like, I guess my plan with this story is to figure out how the narrator Riz deals with grief versus his family, and how he feels that only he has real grief for his brother's death. Like, he feels like nobody else really is putting in the effort to grieve the way he is. And that's like in the future as I'm writing it. But I think like that's one of the things I'm thinking about is, you know, individual grief or individual feelings about something can be completely fully true and fully define a person, but they might not even exist to the person right next to them, to their parents, to their siblings, to whoever. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think truth even if truth doesn't matter unless it's complete, there's so many truths that build up people. Like, you can't stop moving. It's not like you can just sit down and be like, well, I'm not going to do anything until I know completely how it needs to be done or what I need to do, because if you won't function. And so we all kind of have to live in this moment where we're living in half truths. We're living in incomplete thoughts and incomplete ideas, but that doesn't mean that we just stop. We keep going and we keep doing things.
Thank you. I love what you said about fiction being a paradox too. Like I agree. I think this will be my last one. I think we're like running over time. But for Jormungand, there's like this really great writer, Lucy Wagner, who I'm obsessed with, and she says that in fiction it's more permissible to like invent and obfuscate, while in poetry, poetry kind of demands more honesty. I feel like that's a very like overly simplistic answer, like overly simplistic way of going about it. But I am wondering if it's true in your own work. I think that, I mean, you answered this before, there's certainly room for obfuscation in poetry, especially, but like for Jormungand, for example, it's so much about appetite and the texture of masculinity. I saw like these, like even just soft and also like brittle, quick, minced, like those are all informants about informants of texture for me. I was wondering though, also there's the relationship between like the real, the visible real and like a fantasized real from the beginning and then nearing the end. How would this play out if this was like a prose piece? Like,
I mean, I guess if it was a prose piece, it would have to follow the journey of this boy growing up and sort of filling himself with ways of being that are harmful to him, ways of being masculine that are harmful to him, and then eventually at the end not breaking free of them, but realizing what they've done to him and slowly moving towards a better place. And I guess it would be like it would follow his experiences of people he meets and dealing with feelings of superiority or inferiority, dealing with feelings of what it means to be a man, right? And I guess that it would just be this like a journey, I suppose. In plot wise, it would be a journey. And then for the poem, I do agree to a certain degree. I think that at least when I started writing, I started writing poetry like seriously like 4 months ago. So it's, but I found that I do tend to veer immediately much more towards honest like sort of digression in my poetry, where I can think about feelings and thoughts and ideas and sort of immediately put them on the page, rather than having to set up the boundaries that sort of capture them the way you have to do in fiction. You have to set up the boundaries, you have to set up the actual, place and time. So, but at the same time, I do play a lot with fiction and poetry. Like, I have no reservation of making fictional poetry, of writing things that aren't necessarily true, as long as the feeling that I'm trying to convey is conveyed. So I think, yeah, I think like texture in poetry is easier to convey simply because you're focusing a lot on language and you're focusing a lot on where individual words are placed and how they sound and what role they play compared to the other words. Whereas in fiction, the way you achieve texture is through like a slow buildup of like constantly applying pressure to certain points in the narrative, and certain applying like pressure on certain characters to act a certain way, And that's how you sort of build texture throughout prose. And then in poetry, it's more linguistic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I have more questions, but like I think I'm gonna end there unless actually I have like one last question, sorry. Is there anything else you want to say about genre or fiction or poetry or anything that you think we missed that you would like to mention?
No, I think like we joke about it a lot in the MFA program about like fiction writers and poets and whatnot. But honestly, I think like the genres are so interconnected that they almost, I feel like a lot of, like when I started writing poetry, I was pretty like sort of self-conscious about, is this good? Is this bad? Like, am I doing it right? Am I doing poetry? And I've had like poets who are writing prose, start writing prose, say the same thing. They're like, we don't know if we're doing it right. And I think that I think like in my opinion, if you can do one, you can do the other pretty well because you have a basic understanding of how to like work language and how to mold it and how to make it sing for you. So I guess I say the genres of poetry and fiction are more or less I don't want to say they're the same thing, but I think they inform one another more than sometimes we give them credit for.
Thank you so much, Ali. You were amazing. Thank you, everyone. Let me stop the screen share. Marissa, do I introduce you? What do I do?
No, you're good. I don't need to be introduced.
Okay.
I am going to introduce Emily though. So let me pull up the bio. Emily Khilfeh is a Palestinian-American writer from Seattle, Washington. She is a graduate of Pacific Lutheran University and a former fellow at the Bucknell Seminar for Undergraduate Poets. She was a shortlist finalist for the 2019 Palette Poetry Prize and the 2019 Frontier Award for New Poets, and her work has been nominated for Pushcart. Her poetry can be found at Up the Staircase Quarterly, Pinwheel Journal, Glass, a Journal of Poetry, and in the 2018 and 2019 Ghassan Kanafani Anthology. Really excited to have you here, Emily, and let's hear some of your work.
Okay, oh my gosh, thank you, Marissa. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks to everybody. And thanks to Waleed, that was really, really good. I really enjoyed hearing your work. I feel so inspired. Oh. Okay, I'm gonna start with poetry and end with a small amount of fiction. So this is Airport Poem. On my worst days, I think this will all be lost. Every last white building and the portraits of the martyrs in the street and every last stone in the street. Call me Generation Rebel. Storefronts left, unfixed from bombs, spill onto the street like sugar bags, burst, and ready to be shaped into something else. Minneapolis. In the ruins of Jerash, we face the four corners of the world. Mecca, Jerusalem, Damascus, the Temple of Zeus. Over the hills are Syria. My father says, there is no Syria. Not anymore. And the things now stolen, the statue of Artemis, Babylonian artifacts crushed under boots, missing Byzantine tiles. The mural was once a deer. The deer walks away from me. What I have are sights and facts. There are not more stars in the desert, even if it feels that way. My drawing of a bomb turned into a lamp, and the Temple of Zeus is used as a military base. Below our feet are the wonders left uncovered. Perhaps that keeps them safe. It's not always good to dig. You'll find uncles left to die. You'll find petty trash left in the street, inheritances left unpaid. Call me Generation Half Marble or Generation Half Lost. You can't call me anything other than hypocrite. Do I feel safe in the scales of the empire? I, a little American thing? Like a reed In an instrument, the call to prayer shakes through me. In time, I'll eat figs in the airport. In time, I'll split the Red Sea. In the street, some children kick a dog. This is also life. My drawing of a bomb turned into a lamp. I use it to light my way home. That's my first one. And then I wrote this other poem on the same trip. That one was from my trip to Palestine. I visited my dad's hometown of Nablus in around this time, actually, in 2018, so about 2 years ago. So that one was about when we visited Jerash, which is in Jordan. And this one is about the ancient city of Sebastia it's in Sebastia, in the West Bank in Palestine. Lachrymose. Sometimes within one egg is another egg. One delicate thing contains another. A poem child, I find myself born like a cross to a white pilgrim world. Mythic style, I drop pearls and pebbles from my palms. I find Sebastia and the grave of the Baptist nestled in the rot. I call myself Lachrymose, tear catcher, vile, finding the place where the women stamped their feet and danced. I'm a crypt keeper, keeping track, nursing rhymes and repenting with, in my teeth, I will bite Arabs, in my legs, I will kick Arabs, in my mind, I will hate Arabs. In me is a rhyme girl rhythm, and the half Arab heart that pilgrims opens. The world, pilgrim, name yourself and hide meaning. Hide sadness between Ibal and Gerazim in the roses and the old tire basket. A gravedigger, encrypted, inside his bones, the Holy Spirit. And inside the lachrymose, tears. A vial holding memory, Victorian in falseness, for although a lachrymatory is a small bottle, there was no proof they were ever meant to catch tears. Meaning made up later, as I am meaning maker. Museums cite me, old Roman coin, old coffin, old steps that take me down to the vault, and the place where the saint sleeps and does not wake, and does not care that we spend our waking days to weep. Tell him to take the head off, Baptist killer. Tell me to take in my teeth, word seeker, being beer, armored in meaning. No bottles to contain what I am born into. And all that I have made me, a collector of tears. Unsettle me, settlers. Let me watch the land go. Undoor the mountain and swallow the key. I know my license plates have no nation. Somewhere in this, I am hidden. If you find me, tell me where. Like a martyr, we turn the eggs in our hands. Take the head off the meaning, silver-plated dancer, and dance. Yay, another poem. It's really weird when everyone else is quiet. Ooh, spooky. All right, I'll do just a short excerpt of my book, partially because there's no partially because. I'm just gonna read an excerpt. I don't have an explanation for this. It is called Hymns for the Broken. And this is a short part from the first chapter, From the Cradle. Layla Shaith began her second life by nearly choking to death on the coin in her mouth. She lunged up and scrambled at the handkerchief tied around her jaw until her fingers caught on the cloth and she could yank it off her head. Then she spat the coin into her hand and breathed for a few startled moments. She stared down at the claw of her fingers holding coin and fabric. the handkerchief a little scrap of blue, and thought, I am alive. She was alive. So she took a moment to categorize what she knew to be true. Her name was Layla. She didn't know where she was. There was an ache in her chest, but it was also a shining feeling, like light catching on a shell. She let the faint glimmer rotate in her thoughts until she could catch the sight, hardly more than a flicker. A memory. There was a house on a hillside, stone walls warmed in the sun, roses by the front door, heavy red that pulled down the stems. There was a front door she could walk into, and figures she could not quite see, waiting just inside the door. She knew if she walked inside, they would be happy to see her. Layla also knew she needed to be concerned with what was happening right now. She was sitting slumped on a porch, her body lined up parallel to the front door of a wood cabin that had seen better days. The thin layer of gray paint had flecked in places, and moss clung between the boards. The forest directly in front of her was a blinding green, and it began its steady pace toward the building. She didn't register she wasn't alone until she heard the rustle of a body standing up, and when she turned left to look at the bottom of the porch stairs, a man with a tear-streaked face stared up at her in utter shock. Layla, he said. He was young, not quite a man yet, really. He had a gaunt, hungry face and light brown skin. His dark hair rested like a curtain on either side of his forehead, brushing almost to the line of his jaw. When he stood up unevenly from his place on the lawn, his black tailcoat was still rumpled, and a tear dripped from his face to the red bandana tied around his neck. He held a black brimmed hat in one hand and a little beaded rosary in the other. The young man flung down his hat and pounced up the stairs, then wrapped her in a throttling hug. He knelt and he held her. It was strange, hearing the sobs of a stranger in her ear. Layla wondered if her mother had thought that when she'd first held her as a baby. Then she wondered who her mother was. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you very much.
So much, Emily.
Thank you so
Incredible
much.
pieces. So I've got a few questions prepared for you. Why don't you
Okay.
fill them up? I'm going to start with your poetry,
Okay.
and with Lachrymose in particular. So just looking at some of these lines, I'm a crypt keeper, keeping track, nursing rhymes, repenting. Tear catcher, grave digger, meaning maker. So you're talking a lot about biracial Arab identity throughout this poem, but alongside that, you're also talking about the identity of being a poet, actually. And so, as a fellow daughter of diaspora, although a very different one, I saw myself thinking a lot about like what it means to be a writer and some sort of record keeper, and in particular, what is one's role or one's responsibility or even one's personal relationship to when it comes to like to those of our lineage that maybe didn't have all the freedom to think their own stories in the way that we're fortunate enough to right now. So what is your kind of take on those kind of questions?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure on children of diaspora. I'm guessing it's probably pretty true in your experience, if I may be so bold. But I think there's a lot of pressure to like tell the story and tell it correctly. And not even correctly, like honestly, like like Waleed was kind of talking about the idea of like how accurate you have to be. I think that's a different topic altogether. But like the idea of trying to prove to your audience, not even your humanity, but like this idea of if I'm a poet who is from America and travels to this country that has so much misunderstanding around it, like Palestine is, a lot of people don't know where it is. A lot of people don't always know what I mean when I say Palestine. And that's that's like on purpose. Like America doesn't want you to know about what's happening in the West Bank. It doesn't want you to know the like Palestinian people, that there's a large Christian population, or like what life is really like in the West Bank. So I think when I went into the travel there and I was like making notes, I felt a lot of pressure to like prove to people that like these were human people and there were people that were worthy of a story or like a lineage that was worthy of being written about. but I also found myself, like in any other place, people are complicated. So I think especially in Lachrymose, I kind of settled into this complexity of contradiction. Like, I'm American and America is helping to occupy the country that my dad's side is from. And then when I went there, it was a great trip and I loved meeting everyone there, but like people aren't perfect there either. So trying to make it as contradictory and complex as I could. I think that was like the most honest way to talk about lineage.
Totally. What a really beautiful answer. So I'm interested too in the kind of emotional movements that this poem is making. So beginning at the very first word, if we can claim the title as that, lachrymose, very mournful. And then like to kind of go on this kind of serpentine questing for name within it, then to end on that final notion of the dance. It just feels incredibly empowering to me. And so I wanted to know, like, for you in writing this poem, how was this movement made, and what does the active definition and then redefinition within it mean to you?
Ah, what a good question. It really is. I think the poem sort of started when I went in Sebastia. There was like a museum and they were showing all the different like old Roman artifacts. And one of them was these little bottles that were like written about as like little tear catcher bottles. And I was like, wow, it's so fascinating because I'm here feeling obligated to like collect all these stories of like tragic things that have happened or like kind of bear witness to what the occupation and like apartheid is really like, and like come back and show people like, well, here's how bad it is. And then when I got back to the States and started to write the poem, I researched the bottles and found out that they weren't actually ever tear catchers. They're probably just perfume bottles. And I was like, oh, I thought it was one thing. And when you looked into it farther, it was way more complicated. And so this idea of when I first kind of went there and thinking, oh, I have to like be as dire so people will like care and understand, and then to find out, well, like these things aren't really tear catchers. Am I really a tear catcher? And then I wanted to like end on this, I don't know if defiance is the right word, but this sense of like, I can be a tear catcher and still also be a dancer at the end of the day too.
Totally, totally. So now let's talk a little bit about airport poem. What kind of was the process of making this poem like? How did it come to you?
So airport poem, like I kind of mentioned before, I started, I was visiting the ruins of Jerash, which is like this giant Roman city in Jordan, actually. I don't know, it's like this huge park and there's like all the ruins and the Colosseum kind of thing. And it was really amazing. And there was this one location that was like called, I think like the Four Crossroads of the Four Corners. And that's where you could see Damascus, Jerusalem, the Temple of Zeus and all that. And originally I was going to write this poem as like kind of like an American crossroads, like deal with the devil, sort of like combining those myths together. But then when I went to Jerusalem, I saw this drawing of a bomb on, like someone had graffitied it. And I had that line, my drawing of a bomb turned into a lamp. And then I kind of went with this idea of, well, what do I do with a poem where I'm trying to get these images and these places together? This idea of like what's hidden and what's revealed. That's it.
And so am I muted? No, you can hear me. Okay. Sorry. Zoom, it's always so strange. So you've mentioned a little bit about the fact that you recently took this trip to your dad's home nation of Palestine, and these poems both have so much to do with referencing that voyage. And so on the whole, kind of what do you feel like that experience meant to you, both as a writer and or just as a person? Was it this your first time going back to your dad's homeland?
Yeah, I'd never been before. When we were younger, obviously it was a little harder to visit, particularly 2001, 2002, there was a war, and it's still occupied, so it's difficult to travel in. There's a lot of checkpoints. It's very scary. Elliot can attest to it. Sup, Elliot. I think, like, what it meant for me as a writer is, like I said kind of earlier, is I really kind of went into, oh, shout out to Elliot, he said yes. When I went into, I was like, I gotta like record everything so Americans understand. Like, I gotta prove to them, because there's a lot of propaganda in really subtle ways. Like, you have to really look for it to understand. I got like a YouTube ad yesterday that was like trying to talk about like the stigma against Israel, and they were just straight up making up stuff about Palestine, and I was like, oh my God. So yeah, like I kind of went into this trip being like, I gotta collect as much information and share as much like truth of the matter as I can. But then also when I was there, I was kind of like, who am I really writing for? And weirdly, I think that question is much more relevant to me right now in fiction than it is in poetry. I think in poetry, I just feel a lot more comfortable with it being, like I was saying, like this contradiction, like more comfortable feeling like this liminality of like Americanness and being Arab, being white passing it is also something that's really important to like talk about in my work as well. And then also kind of like this sense of, how to explain this? I don't know. Like in poetry, it feels like I can really talk to people who have a similar like background as me. But then when I get to fiction, depending on like what you're doing, especially since I'm writing like young adult, I think that there's a sense of like what's marketable, and it's hard making that decision between feeling like, can I write these stories and still get published, or should I simplify them for people so that it would actually get sold? Like, I feel like it'd be easier if I was doing like a post 9/11 immigrant to America, I love it here sort of story, but like that's just not genuine to me, and it would feel fake. So having to choose like what kind of narrative I'm actually telling, like how, like who do I really care about when I'm writing? I think that trip really solidified that for me. Like I really care much more about this liminal identity than I do about trying to prove people are like all good or all bad.
So I feel like my next question, in certain ways, you kind of answered within this question. So I'll move on to the one that I'd kind of planned after that. So what does home mean to you? What does homeland mean to you? And in your personal kind of Venn diagram, what would lie at the center of the two for you?
Oh my gosh, you asked the hard-hitting ones. At the like risk of sounding super tacky, like, because I feel like my identity is between the two places, like I feel both like really close to these nation, or like the nation of Palestine, because my dad is like the first person who, or not the first person, but he moved here, and like we still have family there, and we still have a lot of access to like what's going on there, so I feel very close to it. But I also feel far away because I don't speak Arabic, I'm not Muslim, like I don't appear, like no one would ever guess. People think I'm like white all the time, they ask my last name's Dutch, etc. So like this sense of like how close and how far I am to these narratives is so different. That the tacky answer is what I really feel like is homeland, is like other people, like my family, these family stories, other children of diaspora, like that's really what the homeland is. And kind of like, I think Ilya Kaminsky was like, at the end of the day, it's really about caring about other people, and the rest of it is all wasting time. I don't know, maybe he didn't say wasting time, but that's sort of idea. That's really homeland.
That is the exact opposite of a tacky answer first. Let me say that. So switching gears, let's talk a little bit about fiction stuff. So I first knew you as a poet through the Bucknell Seminar, but you're a prose writer as well. You've just finished your first novel, or at least recently finished your first novel. So I want to know kind of, what does prose unlock for you that maybe poetry doesn't or can't, and also vice versa? What does kind of the world of poetry unlock for you that is outside of fiction?
I think something that I really like about fiction, I think Waleed kind of talked about this a bit too, this idea of like you can have a character who grapples with an idea for a long amount of time, watching them gradually fight with like the big question of the story, and also having like characters argue with each other. Something that I hopefully did in Hymns for the Broken was, I have Layla and her sister, and they have the same experience of being refugees from their homeland, but they have a different like perspective on what they should do with their identity. Layla wants to remember it and to go back, and Miriam wants to assimilate and let go. So there's a conflict there, but I think as readers, there's an ability, or as a writer in fiction, there's an ability to have neither of them be correct. And I like that like constant kind of like back and forth between character with that. I think poetry, you can do it. I think it's possible. I think I have never achieved it in poetry. Vice versa, or on the other hand, I suppose, poetry allows for a little bit more space for contradiction, I think. There's a lot more sense of never having to declare what the world is. Kind of like with Lachrymose or with Airport Poem. It's like a mixture of like things I've experienced firsthand, myths, different places all in one like short amount of space on the page, one short like narrative arc happening with all these different things. You don't have to be as declarative, I think, in a lot of ways. I think in fiction, what I struggle with the most is declaring what the world is like so that we can allow the characters to grapple, but then I have to kind of like decide what kind of world it is, meaning like I have to declare what the nations are doing, what they're trying to achieve. And I think I struggle with that a lot more because I want it to be more contradictory than I think readers, especially young adult readers, necessarily need.
Cool. So on that note too, why did you choose to write YA? And why kind of this like speculative genre of YA in particular? What kind of led you to this particular kind of fiction in the fiction world?
I think I was drawn to YA mostly because I think, as you may have noticed, a lot of my work is talking about identity and like, who are you? And I think that's a very, like, YA is a very fruitful place for that to be a conversation, because I think YA is sort of the area where people are, or like young people are asking themselves, like, who am I? And like, why am I going to be this person? Or like, what am I going to do with this information to like become the person I want to be? So I feel like it's a good like kind of age range. And as far as speculative, I think, like I said before, I just really like myth and things that aren't quite like realistic, and then having to have characters then grapple with the kind of like inner truth of what it means to like go have ghosts or myths or etc. like show up in their lives.
Yeah, I can definitely see fiction kind of, or speculative fiction being a space where there's maybe more room for the kind of contradiction that you were talking about earlier. There might be a kind of a more hardline realistic, genre. Cool. Well, let me find my next question. Are there particular craft aspects of poetry that you feel like have influenced your fiction, or the other way around? Are there kind of like technical craft things from your fiction that you may have brought into your poetry as well?
Well, I think like Waleed said earlier, they're very closely related. I think something from fiction that I bring to poetry, or try to, is the idea of like a narrative arc. I think whatever starts at the beginning, I'm trying to prime for what will happen at the end. I had a fiction professor who always was like, your first line is declaring what's happening at the last line. So I think that's kind of what I have taken into poetry. I think as far as what poetry is in for my fiction is a style where I like approach it as like, if I can get one very strong image, I don't need two. I think it kind of leads to like a more minimalist style, which is sometimes like not always to my advantage because I kind of underwrite. I think that's a struggle. But on the other hand, this like precision of like word and choice, like Waleed was saying, this really like purposeful layering of language, I think can show up in my fiction more often.
Yeah, I once had a poetry professor that described poetry as like minimum words, maximum impact. I feel like reading through your fiction is clear that kind of influence is present. Two more questions, and then I'll leave you to your Sunday evening. So let me unlock my phone where I'm reading the questions from. Okay. So the first land people, they're hundreds of tribes. You mentioned the stealing of land. From early on, we're aware that matters of colonization are going to be at the heart of this narrative. And then there's also a part in which the character's half-brother Otto is saying that either the land was occupied or it came together, and then it came together, or it came together then it was occupied. He doesn't quite remember which. And then we have the main character being revived from her death with no memory, only the coin in her mouth. And so the idea of memory is also very present here. And so I just wanted to, can you talk a bit about how these two kind of themes are working in this novel, and why, and kind of why and how you chose to include them in these ways?
Mm-hmm. I think as far as memory and colonization, I think something that, like, it's a very big question for a lot of, I would say, children of immigrants or children of the diaspora, is like, who am I if I don't know where I came from, or who am I if I forget where I used to be? And I think that's a question of this whole story, which is, if the land is occupied and the land is gone, what does that make you? Like, are you still from your identity? And I think that, like, having that uneasiness of always questioning after, like, who you are really ties into, like, the use of Layla, because she doesn't remember who she used to be. So her trying to go back and regain her memories is a really literal way of, like, trying to reclaim her identity of who she used to be, versus, like, other characters who might already know, or characters who want to forget. So this idea of, how do you be who you are if you don't remember?
So my last question is, back in reference to the main character, Layla, who wakes up with the coin in her mouth and no memories. What could you maybe call, or would you call your own coin in the mouth? What do you think is the thing that kind of tethers you to a you, or to a heritage that you're part of?
Yeah, I feel like, again, not to be super cheesy, but definitely, like, family and other people. I think that's ultimately, like, what it comes down to. I think especially talking about, like, these big, difficult ideas of, like, occupation and genocide and apartheid and all these things that, if you're really researching and spending a lot of time with, it can be really hard to always face. But at the end of the day, if your active life is about caring about and loving other people, that can be something that tethers you to who you are still, no matter what happens.
Thank you so much, Emily, for your time and your thought, your art, and your answers. Thank you as well, Waleed, for all the same. It was really wonderful having you both here.
Yes, it was lovely to hear your work.
Yeah, you guys are really incredible writers on human code. I want to just, before we head out, take a moment to briefly, if there are any questions from the floor of viewers that you guys want to ask. Now's your moment.
There's a chat.
There is a chat. Yeah, feel free to type them in the chat and I can read
Yeah,
them.
but I think that none of us can use it.
Oh,
Never mind.
never mind.
Except Rachel.
Rachel.
Sorry, I think you should be able to use it. Let me see. Oh, nope. Okay, now you can. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Okay. If anyone has any questions they want to ask our interviewees, here's your chance. I'll give a few moments to see if anyone puts anything, and then otherwise we'll wrap up.
Well, people are thinking I can ask Waleed a quick question.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
What instigated starting poetry? You said it was a couple months ago?
Like, the first thing I wrote in 2020 were like these 2 short poems. I don't know. I had writer's block. I go through writer's block all the time for fiction. So I was like, well, instead of kind of like wasting my time not writing, why don't I try to write something short and quick? And so I was like, I kind of just decided to try poetry because I'm surrounded by poets all the time at the MFA. So yeah, I mean, I kind of just, I thought, it was a way for me to kind of like when I'm writing and I'm stuck in a story, I'll just write like tons of crappy dialogue to get me moving. So kind of like a bigger version of that, where I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna write these crappy poems to try and get me to move towards some like more fiction. But yeah, but then I guess I kind of got into it, and I kind of like, I'm not surprised I got into it, because I think even in my writing, I kind of like playing with language and grammar. This was like, oh, I get to go all out and actually just like sort of free ball and see what happens. So I just ended up doing more and more of it.
Very cool. Ooh, Oh,
So we've got a question. What are some, sorry?
Sorry, you can read it. It's good.
I guess, yeah, everyone can see this. Sorry. What are some themes each of you see cropping up consistently in your writing?
oh my gosh.
I'll
That's
let
a
you answer first, Emma.
Oh, why? Okay. I think themes I talk about a lot. Heritage, obviously. Family. I think memory and like loss of memory or regaining memory has come up a couple of times. I read a lot about siblings. Shout out to my siblings. What else is there?
I mean, I can say something. I don't.
Yes, please save me.
I don't know. I feel like I write about stuff that almost never like relates to each other. Like right now, I'm writing short stories right now, so it's like I feel like each of them are somewhat different. But I guess I kind of veer towards writing characters who have to do something that they don't want to do, and kind of putting them into these situations where will they do it? Will they not? Or if they do it, then what happens? How do they feel? What's the fallout from that? What's the fallout from them not doing it? So I guess I like, yeah, putting my characters into tough spots, and then like specifically in like people who just, they have to do something that they're uncomfortable with. I guess that's a theme, like a running theme. But otherwise I write about like so many, I feel like I'm all over the place in subject matter.
I feel like I write the same things all the time. Just like inheritance, empire, occupation. Bam, bam, bam.
I kind of wish that I had like something I could stick to. Otherwise I'm just like, here's a story about this. Here's a story about like a ghost. Here's a story about burning down an animal hospital. Here's a story about like a plague or something, just like all over the place. I don't know.
All right. Oh, we got Kate with a question. What are the both of you reading right now that makes you want to write?
Oops, sorry.
How was that a start?
No, that was me. The grammar mistake was me, not you, Kate.
Shout out to Kate. What am I reading right now that makes me want to write? I'm just gonna go first, Waleed. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
I just got George Abraham's new book called Birthright, which I'm super excited about. Yes, it's really good. Okay, I started reading a bit of it. It's really, really good. I love his writing. I love like reading somebody who I'm like, I know what he's talking about, and it makes me feel like I can write about like this experience as well.
My best friend did the cover art. I'm sorry.
Really? It's really good. Wow, I love
My best
it.
friend Jazz in Texas. I love them. Sorry.
Awesome.
Whoa.
Layla Shadi just did I listened to her reading as well. Her work is really, really good. And then I'm trying to think of fiction. I don't know.
We have to find like my book that I was reading. I forget the title.
I keep reading the same poem, The Orange by Wendy Cope, I think, over and over again. I'm like, there we go. There's still some hope left in this empty heart.
I don't read, but yeah, I don't read. But no, I think like I'm not reading any fiction right now, but I think the last book that I read that seriously, I guess, kind of fell in love with, and then I guess informs the type of stories that I like to write and kind of want to write, is The Emissary by, I forget her name, Yoko Tawada, I think.
Can you all drop these in the chat so everyone has them?
Yeah.
You all have to read that book. Waleed lent it to me, and it changed my life.
Let's write it down.
Weird.
Yeah, so this little short little baby novel by Yoko Tawada called, well, I sent out, that didn't go to everybody. Called The Emissary, and it's about like this weird post-apocalyptic Japan where old people kind of like it's almost satirizing Japanese politics and things, but at the same time it's just filled with like, it's so genuine and filled with like a lot of joy, but also a lot of deep sadness. And it's about this like post-apocalyptic future where children are born like decrepit and their limbs are failing and they're not able to like eat fruit that's too citric or something, and they can only like walk for a couple years, but the old people are like living forever and ever. And so but it's like 130 140 pages, and it was really wonderful. And I'm currently reading Edgar Kuhn's Tap Out.
Oh,
I love the cover for it. And it's like working class, like blue collar poetry, and it's really cool. It talks about like, I guess, stuff that I'm interested in and like looking at in poetry. But yeah, that's what I'm currently at.
I have a
All right.
question for both of you. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have a question. I sent it to Marissa. We did want to ask you this if we had time at the end of the interview, both of you, Emily and Waleed. So in your fiction pieces, you're both kind of writing about the idea of death not truly sticking. I saw that as like I don't know, it was something that I saw as not only a reality bending thing, but also kind of like a time traveling or time slowing thing, because I think you're trying to draw out the moment before someone is truly, truly gone, which doesn't have to be instantaneous, but like can be. Maybe they can come back a few times. You know, you both invented these layers of being gone to explore. So it made me think a lot about time and how you make time work in fiction. And also poetry too, if you want. I guess the question is just like, how do you make someone feel time in either genre? Is that a stupid question?
no, I like it.
I feel like time is something I always struggle with in fiction, and when I write, is how to transition from moment to moment. I feel like that's one of the big things that I'm always kind of stuck on, is like, am I underwriting? Am I overwriting? Am I describing too many menial things or not enough? I guess in this story, what I'm working towards is, I guess one of the things that I'm trying to do to make it feel like that the character, that the narrator is stuck, is to, I guess one trick is to constantly have them wanting to do something and not being able to do it. And I guess that's like going back to what I said before, but like miniature versions of that, and they keep thinking about it, but they don't do it, and then they move to the next unimportant task, and then they move to the next unimportant task. And so like in this story, in the excerpt that I read, I guess I was playing with this idea of like of the narrator kind of wanting to like scream and let out his like anger and sadness, but he just kept thinking about doing it, and then he'd move to the next thing, and then he'd think about it again, but he'd move to the next thing. And it kind of makes you feel stuck. At least, I mean, that's the effect that I'm hoping the reader feels, is that they feel stuck the way that the narrator is feeling stuck. And then finally, when you allow it to happen, it should feel hopefully as like a release for the reader as well as for the character. And then you can move to the next thing and kind of hold. I guess it's almost like levitating, where you're not actually flying, but you're not falling, and you're stuck. And you're trying to like force the reader to feel the same way.
Yeah, I feel like for me, on a broader sense, that kind of connected to the question Marissa asked me earlier about memory and colonization, but particularly memory. I think something that I tried to capture with time in this book is the sense of always wanting to go back to the way things used to be. There's a really strong tension, like not even just metaphorically, but literally, where Layla is always thinking about like who she used to be when she remembered everything, because she did lose her memories when she was brought back to life. So like not even just metaphorically her old life, but like literally who she was. And also kind of having Otto there as someone who does remember. So that sense of like there's someone who is a timekeeper and like a memory keeper versus someone who is trying to get that back and always thinking about what was versus like where they have to be right now.
I got a question. I'm interested in hearing more about the relationship between your characters and their worlds, or how they interact with autonomy and choice in creating / finding their identity.
What a good question. Waleed, you want to go first?
I feel like I was thinking about this the other day or something, like it got brought up. I think I like writing stories or situations with characters who, I guess I don't know, maybe I have like a mean streak in my writing, but I love writing characters and situations in which they're up against like some sort of force, or they're up against some sort of moment or feeling that, you know, they want to overcome and the reader wants them to overcome. And I absolutely love having them fail miserably. Because I think what I like writing about is this idea of what, I feel like I grew up reading all these stories and watching all these movies and shows and stuff where like there's this big force, whether it's traditional good or evil or just like internal crises you kind of come up against, like you overcome it eventually, and that's like the heroic climax of the novel or the movie or whatever. And I kind of love doing the opposite of that, where it's like what value can you take from a life lived that cannot win, that can't overcome the forces, when the forces are bigger than the individual, you know, what hope and what joy can I kind of like draw out of that situation? Which is why I love that book so much that I was talking about, The Emissary, because I love writing about inevitability and like, if the inevitable is going to happen, like, you know, it is inevitable, what do the characters do up until they reach that point? So I kind of like having, I know, and I mean, a lot of people probably don't, a lot of people probably hate that, but I love this, like, you kind of know, or you've been promised what's going to happen at the end, and now you're there to see what the character does with that information and how they interact with not having any actual autonomy, or only having autonomy up until that specific point.
Yeah, that's such a good way to put it. I feel like I write similarly to that idea of like my characters often come against these giant forces like occupation or colonization. Like how does these like two characters possibly defeat this entire force? And yeah, that idea of like there's an inevitability of like loss always on the horizon, but then how do the characters then interact with like who they are with the people around them if they know they're still going to lose what they have? And I think also as far as like their autonomy, I think something that I like to have my characters do is talk about race within like Otto can't pass as white, obviously he's going to appear as like a native character, versus Layla, who is white passing, and this like inevitability of Layla always being sort of hidden and Otto always having to be who he is and having that be a part of their stories as well. Like Layla wants to be from her heritage even if she doesn't look it, and kind of deciding internally and with how you interact and understand other people's experiences versus like how mainstream might see you.
how do you see your characters interacting with the concept of hope? Does it truly exist, a deconstruction, reconstruction, or is there an intermediate point?
I gotta be honest, guys, I didn't think people were gonna ask questions.
we might
But
make this the last one because it's starting to get late.
these are,
But
they're like,
Oh
real-
yeah,
these are real legit.
yeah,
these are great
good ones.
questions.
These are really good ones.
They're better than the ones I wrote. Yeah.
Yeah, shout out Ryan, thanks.
I mean, I guess it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier in that I love, well, let me give I'm just gonna like nerd out about this book, The Emissary. Pretty much the entire situation of that book is this like, it's a horrible state of the world, and like there's all these like lines and sort of internal thoughts from some of the characters of like, will we ever be able to go outside again? Will we ever be able to have a picnic? Or like able to eat fruit in a couple of years. And yet what Yoko does so well is that she makes the characters who are suffering the most, the children, gives them this like total sense of, they're completely aware that they're suffering and that they're aware that their family members think they're suffering, but because they haven't lived any other way, they haven't ever experienced the lack of that suffering, they're just full of like life and energy and kind of just like happiness because they get to be alive. And I mean, and I'm putting it simplistically, there's more to it, but there's this like sense of hope and joy that comes from individual interactions between these characters, whereas the despair is the rest of everything. And yet the hope between two small, like a family, just a family is enough to, at least for me personally, to carry me through the end of the story and still feel like I read a story that wasn't inherently tragic or inherently like just super, like, you know, like it didn't leave me down in the dumps. And I guess I kind of want to try and do that in my work as well, is to even if situationally there's a lot of despair, that can you as individuals still feel or still attain some type of, you know, hope or happiness or something like that. So I guess I'm in like this weird middle point where I want to see if these characters can feel hope in terrible situations.
Yeah, I agree. I feel that as well. This idea of there's so much despair around, but then having characters have hope. And also I think it depends, because I am trying to write for like a bit of a younger audience. I think that I want that element of, there's still like the realism or the pessimism, I don't know if that'd be the right word, of like what's really going on, like an occupation or colonization or like things that have already happened. But still giving characters this ability to have a bit of like a way out, or resulting like internally this idea of hope. I think something that is important in Layla's character is this idea of, even if the land is taken from me, who I am can't be taken from me. I think that's like an element of hope I try to get in all my narratives.
All right. Can we get one more round of applause for our incredible readers tonight? Thank you all so much for everything you've offered us this evening, starting with your written words and ending with your spoken ones. It's been a really wonderful conversation. And thank you all who are here listening, and for your really incredibly intelligent, great questions that you've offered here at the end. And
Yeah,
now I'll leave you guys to your Sunday evening.
Clap for Marissa, clap for Rachel.
Clap for Rachel.
Yay, thank you guys. Thank you so much for having us. It was great meeting you, Waleed, and everyone else who's here.
It was great. Thank you for
We'll
time.
Thank you
We'll
so much,
be
everyone.
back again with something else next Sunday night, so feel free to join us then. And until then, have a wonderful evening and a wonderful week.
Thanks, everyone.